Okay, so I think we're good on the recording stuff. I have been putting off making this video for a long time. I've tried probably 6 or 7 times and never gotten further in than a couple minutes. I think part of it is that I have always hated hearing and seeing myself on video. It's one of my biggest insecurities, like all the way from middle school and high school. So 36 now. I talk all day for work to an audience, if you can consider students an audience. And it's good to know that absolutely no emotional progress has been made. So I still hate it. And I think the other thing is that the further I get in terms of tapering off of methadone, the more I realize how different from my like normal or my baseline I am. I can tell, maybe if you don't know me well, you would think that some of these things were just quirks or how I normally am, but I am so sort of like my cadence is off. I'm reaching for words, and just the way I look, especially my eyes and my facial expressions, are very different from how I would be if I weren't on a strong dose of opioids still. So I guess there's some insecurity about that, especially because I feel like I'm like meeting new people in a way, I am, in putting these videos out, and the temptation is to want to wait until I feel like myself again. But I low key think it will be very cool in 3 months or 4 months when this taper is over to look back and to see the progress that I've made. It is going to get worse before it gets better, particularly because, as I'll talk about later on in the video, tapering off of methadone at a rate that is faster than like even very hardcore gels do it. So there's going to be a lot of withdrawal in between now and the end, but it will be cool at the end to just see sort of like the difference between now and then. So anyway, if you are a Concrete Confessional blog reader, thank you for watching this video. And if you are watching this on YouTube for the first time, thank you for joining us. And I hope you come back, whether for reasons of schadenfreude or just appreciating the trash can fire, or, more sort of altruistic or kind reasons. You're all welcome. But yeah, so the purpose of today's video is twofold. It's to just give sort of an overview of my addiction and recovery attempts, because what I realized was that a lot of people come to my content by way of my blog. Right now, that's the only way to come to my content, but specifically within the blog, they're arriving at my pages, which I can see through my analytics on, my articles about at-home opiate detox, and some little articles I've written about the science of partial agonists versus full agonists and things like that. And so from there, they just click on the recommended articles. And because of that, they follow like a very unpredictable scattershot path through the content that I've made, which, to be fair, was out of order anyway, if you're talking about chronological order. So I wanted to, either in the drop down box, or if you're watching this on the blog, in the text below the little video window, I'm going to put an index of, I guess, not major articles from the blog, but maybe the content that I think is most, it contains a lot of my story, or that I'm most proud of, I guess. I'm going to put links to those articles or blog pieces, whatever you want to call them, with short descriptions after, and I'm going to organize them by category. So whether they are like just stories, trip reports, stories about active addiction, stories about 12-step recovery or other types of recovery, rehab, stories about, or pieces about the science of addiction and recovery, pieces about xylazine and trank, and news related to policy and the drug war. So I'll put that all below so that anyone who's watching this who wants to read any of that will be able to find it more easily. So hopefully that will help. So, and the purpose is to give an overview of my story, and also just briefly to summarize what's going on now with the methadone withdrawal, where I am in that process, and what the plan is going forward. So, all right, without further ado, to the first point, I have been doing drugs for a very long time. I'm 36 years old, as I said, and the first time I got messed up on anything, I was like 10 or 11 years old, and my cousins and I, who were the same age, pilfered gin from a family member's house, and we drank a ton. To this day, I've only had gin that one time because I got so sick. I think we drank like 2/3 of a bottle between three of us, and one of us was barely drinking. So it was a pretty rough first experience with alcohol, but the theme across all of my first experiences with substances, which followed very, in short order in the years after that first experience with alcohol, was that especially when it came to these anxiolytic downer drugs, as soon as I felt them enter my system, it wasn't so much like an issue of, okay, I'm fucked, I'm screwed up now, I'm different. It was an issue more of like, okay, this feels right. Like this feels like something is corrected. Like this huge internal tension that I hadn't even fully realized that I had, especially when I was young, until it was gone, was finally like released. And I was like, oh, like it was a feeling of like I can do this now. So very quickly after that first dose of alcohol seeped into my system. Like by the time I was in sixth and seventh grade, I was coming home from cross country practice and pouring myself like a little bit of whatever wine my mom had open at the time and just sipping that before I started my homework. And I got really attached to that, and it would throw me off if I didn't have that. Like I would look forward to that all day. So that would become a motivating pattern in my life too, that these depressant drugs were a way to sort of like deal with pressure from everything in life. But anyway, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself already. So yeah, 10, 11, and I start drinking. So after that, I have a couple years of basically just trying weed. And then as I get into high school, I was a freshman in high school, the time when my older brother, who was definitely more like socially savvy and popular, was a senior. So I had a lot of access to experiences through him that I wanted that I wouldn't have necessarily had otherwise. So basically, we started experimenting with drugs together. And I was freshman, sophomore when most of those foundational chemical experiences happened. So tried acid, mushrooms, weed, like I said, coke, benzos. I think I tried Xanax and Klonopin to begin with. The first drug that really knocked my socks off was ecstasy. And I tried that my freshman year of high school. At that time, there was this website called ecstasydata.org. So you could put in your location, you could put in the stamp on the pill. And if someone had submitted this pill for testing, which there was a really good chance that someone had, you could see what active ingredients had been found. So the first pill I rolled on, they were called Blue Dolphins, and we looked them up, and they were sure enough like the only active ingredient in them was pure MDMA, and it was an incredible roll. So I talk about a lot how I've always, for the reason of wanting relief and anxiety dissipation, I've always been a downer person. But what E did for me was it broke down all the social barriers. In addition to this incredible physical high, like it's an pathogen. It has been used with success in therapy for that reason. It's just like all of those socially installed barriers around yourself that completely melt away. So you are like conversing so openly, everything feels so significant, you feel so close to other people. For me in particular, that was like almost like an emotional salvation, because even though people have described me as like very social in high school and even more so in college, people would describe me as popular in a way. I have always had a really hard time communicating with people. Honestly, I've always felt very separate from people. And even though I've always had like plenty of friends, I've often had the perception that I didn't have people who are similar to me to talk to very frankly, or at least not many of those people, and that the people who I did have didn't necessarily view me in the same way that I viewed them for reasons that are hard to describe. But anyway, ecstasy took all of that away. There's a YouTube creator who I've watched for a while called Dorian Bridges, who's sort of a UK Hunter S. Thompson type figure. And one of the things that they say in their content is the gateway drug is the first drug that you really fall in love with. And I love that. And it was Molly or E for them, and it was E for me too. So started rolling freshman year, got really, really into that. And significantly, my first experience with strong opioids was with 15 milligrams of Oxy. And I actually, it was a stupid, stupid thing. I misheard my dealer. I was buying pills in school, and I thought he was offering me really cheap rolls. And so I thought he was saying E instead of Oxy. We were like trying to do this quickly. So I gave him $20 and I got 3 pills, and I was like, what the hell? But, now I look them up and I'm like, okay, this is something I can actually, get high on. So of course I'm going to try it. And from the time that I tried that 15 milligrams of Oxy, I had basically no interest in trying any other drug for the rest of my life, other than opioids, I should say. So within that family, I still wanted to try out everything I possibly could. But other than opioids and benzos, like I was home. It's just like the feeling of contentment, that relaxed contentment coupled with a really strong euphoria was absolutely what I had been searching for without knowing it. And once I found that, again, the drive to try other drugs, like it's been well over a decade since I tried a new psychedelic or something like that now. So in the beginning, I had been very into the sort of psychonaut, try acid and you get very awed by the perceptual fireworks and that kind of thing. But it very quickly became something that was just about finding that relief and that space of feeling just totally content and just at ease with myself and the world. Something else I should probably mention that is a little bit difficult to talk about because I never discuss specifics with family members' mental health struggles, but on both sides of my family, and particularly on my mom's side of my family, addiction is really heavily represented. So, on my mom's side of the family, almost every guy in her generation has had some, significant substance abuse problem, and that goes at least two generations up. So my great grandfather was a really bad alcoholic, which is why my grandfather never did anything other than drank 2 beers, really strictly observed limit, his whole life because his father had had such a hard time with alcohol. So that side of my family, and it's not just the guys, several of the women have had problems with drinking their pills or whatever. It is incredibly prevalent. And on the other side of my family, prescription drug addiction is not completely absent either. So yeah, I definitely had the background. I remember my mom mentioning that to my brother and me, and I remember really early on just having a strange attitude about it. I was never that person who said like I'm never going to become an addict. It's not going to happen to me. Just I actually, from an early age, thought like I probably am the person who's going to go down that path, but I didn't care. And when I was young, I had no internalization of risk. I shouldn't just say when I was young, because to a large extent today, I still don't have much internalization of risk. Like I can sort of cognitively appreciate risk and I can plan around that. But in terms of like really feeling that like the shaky terror that you should feel when you do some of these things. Like when I shot up for the first time when I was 15 or 16, when I tried heroin that way for the first time, I don't remember being scared at all. And I knew I was doing it with someone who was experienced, but still, like, there was a huge amount of proportional fear that I should have felt about, even if I didn't die in that moment, what I was doing in my life. And I just, for some reason, that risk doesn't seem to connect. I think part of it has to do, honestly, with just low self-worth. And on that topic, it has been sort of a point of pride for a long time not to talk too much about how this affected me, because on the one hand, I was never like systematically bullied about my sexuality. So I don't want to like talk over gay people who have had a much rougher go of it with their family and their friends in life. Because in a certain way, like I have had a very privileged passage through that whole arc of being gay. But on the other side of that, I grew up Catholic in a very conservative small town, and it was definitely an added sort of barrier to connecting with people and feeling a part of community, to feel like I had to keep that sort of separate to myself, even though it was obvious to the people around me. And eventually, like by the time I graduated high school, it was either openly acknowledged or implicitly acknowledged by everyone I was dealing with. So that was another thing that sort of played into the feeling of social isolation, paradoxical social isolation, and also just a feeling of being uncomfortable with myself. And like I talked about at the start of the video, like with how I sounded, with how I looked, there was this, when I was young, there was, and it's a typical teenager thing, it's certainly not unique to me, there was just a really high degree of internal tension and not feeling sort of at ease with myself. So anyway, I am graduating from high school and always had kind of I think complex character is a nice way to put it. But the same time that I'm sort of like doing everything I can to party and implode my life, I'm also like very into school. And I had always, so even if I didn't believe that it would actually happen for me, I had always got my life together enough on paper to get into a good college. I applied early decision to the Ivy League school that was closest to me, which was Cornell. So the year before I applied, it was rated, I think, like the hottest Ivy by US News. More importantly to me, it was voted America's most Hogwarts-like college. So deal done. Didn't even consider applying to a quote unquote better school, even though I could have numbers wise. So got an early decision. And the first year of college was like absolutely, bar none, one of the best years of my life. Like, just golden time. So I'm in a new town and I am killing it academically. I'm surrounded by people who are much more like me in a lot of expected and unexpected ways compared to the people I was in high school with. And it's so like, it's like ghost. She even mentioned it now, I know, but like, did super well academically, especially my first year. Like my GPA was the highest on my floor and probably in my freshman building. And this is at a school of super geeks. So it meant a lot to me, not in like a superficial sense, but in the sense of like, wow, I went to a very average, being kind public high school. I had some great teachers along the way, but like now I was at a university where there were like real luminaries looking at some of my work, and to have people still say like, wow, what you're putting forth has value, meant a lot to me. And what I was studying was, freshman year was spread all over the place, but it was absolutely fascinating to me. I have always been kind of like scholarly oriented, and it is one of my biggest regrets that my addiction has kept me from finishing medical school or other graduate school, because I've kind of thought that I love teaching, but by this point in my life, I kind of thought I would be working on interesting, complicated problems in a different way than I am now. So anyway, loved that first year of college, did very well socially. The drug thing was very minimally present. I think I had friends from home visit me once or twice. Someone might have brought me Suboxone, and other than that, there was essentially nothing other than collegiate weed and alcohol use. Okay, so freshman year is almost over, and I start writing for the school newspaper. There's this girl, I'm pretty sure I can use her real name. I'm sure I can use her real name, actually. Her name is Carrie Blakinger, and she is now a nationally renowned investigative journalist who writes about the war on drugs and criminal reform and, criminal justice system reform and things like that. But the time that I met her, she was an editor for the newspaper, and gay people have gaydar, and druggies have, I don't know what you call it, like druggadar. And I met this girl at the newspaper, and I realized pretty early on, she had Adderall. Realized after that she had Xanax. Realized after that she had a sketchy towny boyfriend who sold some of those things. And one day I'm talking to her, and she mentions, "Oh, I have a morph script from when I broke my back." And at that point, I'm like, absolutely confirmed that this girl is further into the drug scene than anyone else I had met in the college town that I was in at the time. So started talking to her, met her boyfriend, and sure enough, they are both heavy heroin and coke users. So from that point through the time that I graduated from college, essentially, I had a regular, just ready hookup in my college town. So I'm still throwing myself into school. I'm preparing myself for applying to medical school in a couple years. And at the same time, I am becoming a more and more isolated, dyed in the wool drug addict. Like I had all of those sort of foundational experiences about getting sick from using drugs, getting sick from, in the sense of stopping using drugs. So opiate withdrawal, getting sick from, injecting and getting weird fevers and sharing needles. So I got hepatitis C toward the time that I graduated from college, and I got so sick from that for a few months. I fought it off, which some people do. Like 20% of people don't progress to chronic infection. But yeah, it made me so sick for a while. I was deathly skinny. Started using benzos really heavily. I got a script, and I would have these awful monthly binges. I always tell everyone, like, if you gave me the choice of not trying benzos or not trying heroin in my life, let's just say strong opioids in general, every single time I would say I would choose not to have tried benzos. Xanax is one of the worst drugs ever invented. It hits so hard and makes you forget everything you're doing. And it is such an incredible magic bullet for people with anxiety that it's so seductive. Like, if you have true anxiety, or even if you don't, once you feel that feeling of being just totally at peace, very hard to walk away from that with life, especially modern life being what it is. And it is such a lie, because the more you take benzos, if you don't have generalized anxiety or panic disorder to begin with, benzos will create that in you. You'll get inner dose withdrawal, you'll get tolerance buildup, and you get this upregulation of these excitatory neurotransmitters to counterbalance what you're doing with inhibitory neurotransmitters when you take the drug. And so you end up with this awful baseline neurochemistry that I am having a hard time, getting away from years off of benzos, where you're never comfortable and you're very panicky, and it's very noticeable to people around you at that point, just like twitchy and panicky. You can never sleep naturally. So benzos are awful drugs. 99% of the stupid shit that I've done on drugs is down to benzos and my own decision making. So, it's not opioids that have caused me to do desperate, embarrassing, awful things. It is every single time benzos. It's an awful combination of disinhibition. So you don't care about doing things that are embarrassing or dangerous in the way that you usually would. You don't remember it. And when you don't remember things, it's very tough to sort of like recondition yourself out of that behavior, because a lot of the oomph of the memories that would keep you away from repeating the mistakes isn't there when you can't remember them, So it's awful, awful drugs. And I went through my first few sets of benzo binges in college too. So I was getting confirmed in my benzo addiction at the same time that I was becoming a daily IV heroin user. So at that time it was heroin still. So by the time I'm in my fall semester of university, everything hits the fan, basically. So I am going home for winter break, and that girl that I was talking about, Carrie, we're kind of friends at this point, or at least as close to that as you can get when the person is your dealer as well. And I forget the exact exchange, but I had told her basically, I'm going home. I don't have anything to bring with me substance wise. And if you know a druggy couple, they are perpetually having these very like histrionic reality TV show fights. So she and Alex had been fighting, and I said, look, I'll give you the keys to my apartment. If, you and Alex are fighting, you can go hang out there, just whatever. If you need some space, you can go hang out there. And it would be nice if you could give me some stuff to bring home with me. So that's what happened. So I go home for winter break within 12 hours. So before I had gotten home, I had gotten my Xanax script refilled, and I had taken like 30 to 40 milligrams. So that's like 15 or 20 times the maximum dose of Xanax that would ever be prescribed. So take that, and then I get home and I immediately shoot up heroin. And when they say that it's like a myth that you can die with a needle in your arm, like my dad literally found me on my bed with the needle still in my arm because I was so zonked on benzos. By the time the little bit of dope hit my system, I was just out. I was unconscious. So I'm in the hospital being treated for an overdose. And when I sort of like wake up after they Narcan me and I am getting my bearings, I see a voicemail on my phone. And already in 2011, voicemails are like going the way of the dinosaur. So kind of piques my interest. I listen, and this is the Ithaca, New York District Attorney's Office, letting me know that they had raided my apartment under a warrant issued in exigent circumstances, which means the normal procedures around searching your property don't apply. They can basically knock down the door and just whatever and whoever is there is open to them. So they were telling me that they had arrested someone on the premises, that they had raided and searched my apartment and found drugs and paraphernalia there. And so this is all ushering in a new era of how I'm getting to know the legal consequences of, at the time in the US, a very sort of like draconian anti-drug system. So it got blown up a little bit in the news. I think there was a Huffington Post article, like that whole like, Ivy League kid angle, which is really stupid because we were not particularly wealthy kids and we were just just desperate addicts. But when Carrie got caught, she had a container that she threw when she saw the cops coming, I guess. It had I think 100 or 150 grams of heroin in it. I don't remember the exact amount, but it was some substantial amount of heroin. When they searched her and Alex's apartment and some other properties that Alex's family owned in town, they found more drugs. As things went, they actually had the lowest amount of drugs, inventory wise, that they would have had at any point in their re-up cycle at that time, which was kind of lucky. But Carrie still got charged with an A felony and ended up doing a year in prison. It's a really big deal to get charged with an A felony because unless you plead it down, you can't get drug court. So you're going to do time. So the district attorney got in touch with me and they were going to charge me with a B felony. So B felony, conspiracy to distribute, because conspiracy is usually one level felony down from, the sort of biggest or most serious charge of the person who is judged to be masterminding the conspiracy. So, and keep in mind, I never benefited from this dealing, or at least if I did, it was in a very peripheral, small way that any addict who's habitually interacting with a dealer will benefit from being around that. My property wasn't used for dealing until that very specific occasion. And the mere specter of being charged with a felony like that is enough to get kicked out of college. Cornell told me that right away. They were like, we've had students in similar situations and they've been gone at this point. What saved me supposedly was a very strong academic record and the fact that I hadn't gotten in trouble before, and also the fact that it was very obvious. I started going through the outpatient assessment process to get enrolled in treatment, and it was very obvious that my addiction was far along, and that it was a situation of desperation rather than a situation of sort of sociopathic, taking advantage of other people's addiction. So anyway, that is all blowing up. I think I might get kicked out of school, and much more worried about, very quickly, I just let go of that. And I'm much more worried about, am I actually going to do time over this? So my mom, who was a criminal defense attorney for most of her career, gets me representation first in Syracuse and then in Ithaca. Shout out to Joe Yock in Ithaca, who phenomenal lawyer and very focused. I think he went to NYU Law, so very technically bright guy, but he would bring his dog to his office and he was very focused on let's try to get you healthy so that you're not repeating this for the rest of your life and that you're not dead, 2 years from now. I hear that my former client is dead of an OD. So he kept my focus on the things that mattered at a time when I was going through a process that kind of tends to just totally absorb you into the moment and the crisis of the present, So should probably send him a Christmas card. If I were a Christmas card person, I definitely would. But he got me a great deal that was basically just an agreement that if I stayed out of trouble and stayed in treatment, I wouldn't be charged with anything. And that was an outcome that was so much better than anything any of the lawyers who I talked to in the beginning of the process told me that I was likely to face. What also helped was that Carrie took all the blame. To this day, I think that if she had tried to get herself out of trouble by implicating everyone else, I probably would have been I would have at least had a much harder fight to extricate myself from the legal ramifications of all of this dealing. So anyway, I basically just took a reduced spring semester course load and graduated on time. And at that point, I'm on Suboxone. So that's what they recommended when I started treatment. I wasn't ready to go completely off of opioids. I had such a low tolerance to the discomfort of withdrawal. Looking back now, what I was going through at that point wasn't minor, but it was moderate compared to the worst that benzo and opioid withdrawal can be. And I really caution people who are going on buprenorphine or methadone maintenance for the first time. It's a hard thing to get a feel for, but basically what I tell people is if you take Suboxone or methadone and you feel better than really crappy, you probably don't need it. If you start taking Suboxone and you're like, this is great, I don't feel high, definitely don't feel high, but I'm not dealing with withdrawal and I can be normal, you're probably not normal and you maybe don't need this drug. So you should probably consider very quickly tapering off of that and saving yourself absolute agony in the future. But anyway, it's just a little aside. So Graduated from college. I'm back in my hometown for a short while I'm applying to jobs. I get a job at a hospital downstate in New York City, and I'm getting ready to relocate. And I've always been restless on maintenance. So it's never really worked for me beyond a few weeks to a few months. It's like that there's some part of me that just it's a case of absolutely getting what you wish for and realizing that what you wish for is really a kind of hell. So like when you're on opioids, especially long half-life opioids 24/7, they do fade into the background in a certain way. You get a lot of the bad effects, but at the same time, the sort of like euphoria and the reinforcing effects get to be less and less. And there's just something about, I've always, like I said, I've had strong emotions. I'm a very sort of like active, energetic person. And there is something about these maintenance drugs that I call it like a dimmer switch. It's like everything about me, like my soul, my creativity, my whole personality and zest for life, it's like turned down rather from like a 9 or a 10 to a 2 or a 3. And that's really tough for me to deal with. It's something that people who love me recognize and gets old really quickly. So, not so long story short, I am relocating to New York City and I cold turkey off of Suboxone. I've never been able to taper well off of any drug. I always end up cold turkeying it, which is the worst way to do it. It actually, it's not just ripping the band-aid off, it maximizes your withdrawal. It can cause this kind of toxicity and long-term damage to your brain. But I did it, and I remember it was like 6 weeks or 8 weeks after I stopped 16 milligrams of sub a day that I could finally sit down and watch like a 20-minute Parks and Rec episode through without just feeling like it was torture to make myself sit through a whole episode. So that's how sort of like physically and mentally restless that made me the first time I went through it. And it's one of those things where if I had known that that kind of state would become almost a new baseline to me and that I would have to go through that experience again and again and again in the next 10 years, I would probably kill myself, have killed myself. So, okay. So I moved downstate, I'm working in the hospital, making not even good money for New York City, all things considered, but more money than, as someone who's only ever been a high school and college student, I've ever had in my bank account at one point. One of my best friends from undergrad, who's from Long Island, has a hookup in the city in Williamsburg. I was like a Williamsburg hipster before that was even a thing. And she introduces me to her, connects. So now I have a way to get benzos and heroin regularly. And basically that whole first year, I didn't even really enjoy New York City. It's one of my greatest regrets is that I was so into my addiction so quickly that I didn't do a lot of the fun, really interesting New York City experiences that are sort of foundational for people who move there early on in life. So long story short, get back into everyday heroin and benzo use. I lose my job because it's so obvious that I'm using on the job and I have to move back home. So at that point, I entered into a cycle that lasts for, see, at least 8 or 9 years that I wouldn't wish on the worst person on earth. So it's just this repetitive hell of relapse, go to inpatient treatment, come out of inpatient treatment feeling good, either completely off of everything or on Suboxone maintenance, get a new apartment, get a new job, hold it together for a few months up to a year or a year and a half. And then, like, this white knuckling just falls apart. I relapse, my life implodes, and okay, back to treatment. So I went through that cycle probably half a dozen times, or maybe even 8 or 10 times in those years. And first time you go through that cycle, there's so much optimism. I'm meeting with a doctor at that outpatient program that I went through during my senior year of college, and she's telling me, I have this great prognostic sense for you. I think you're going to be one of these people who really puts it behind you. You got so much going for you, and I see you in med school in 2 years. So you get your hopes up, you put everything you have into 12-step recovery or whatever else you're doing. For me, it was usually 12-step recovery. Your family sees you get it together, and there's so much hope and optimism on the part of everyone to begin with, and so many resources directed your way. And then you relapse, and it's like, okay, relapse is a part of recovery. Okay, it's it's expected to have some difficulty along the way. and then it happens again and again. And all your own hope and all everyone else's hope is gradually like seeping out of this sieve. And it's just, it is an incredibly disheartening thing to go through. You realize that the people who are telling you to follow their program don't even have a success rate of like 6 or 8% most of the time. You realize that the treatment that you really need is not covered by your insurance company, and it would set you back, 50, 100 grand that you certainly don't have as a drug user minimum to get quality treatment that's individualized and that lasts for long enough to get you to that 1 year and then 5 year point where the success rates are much higher. So I'm going to do a whole video about what evidence-based treatment for opioid addiction that doesn't involve maintenance really is, and what practices actually support a success rate that's higher than just a single digits, basically. But for now, let me just say that I was stuck in that cycle. I was moving all over to try to sort of like start new when I got out of treatment, or sometimes even for treatment. So during the height of the for-profit treatment craze down in Florida, there was this thing called the Florida Shuffle that I was a part of. So you would go down there, they would pay for your plane ticket. You'd go to this pretty bougie rehab if you had decent insurance. And after that, there would be halfway houses that would literally, if you wanted to use, they would literally give you money to relapse with, because at that point they can bring you back into the fold, put you through inpatient treatment again. You stay there for a couple of weeks, you get out, they cut you a check. They were literally giving drug addicts kickbacks for attending treatment because they were making so much money, mainly from conning the urinalysis. It turned it into a racket where they were, I was in inpatient treatment, it was lockdown. They were drug testing all of us for like dozens of chemical agents, some of which were so obscure that I've never heard of them on the US recreational market, every single day. And they were doing that because the profit margin on those drug tests, which were often run in-house, because these big rehabs like very quickly learned how to con this whole process, the profit margin was huge. So they would make maybe $100 or more from each of those GCMS confirmed urine tests. So anyway, I was part of the Florida Shuffle. I went down there and did treatment for 2 months at this place called Palm Partners. It was actually a good experience. I was there for the quote unquote right reason of getting clean. I liked that in Florida they wouldn't do maintenance because of some regulations that they had down there at the time. They could use those long-acting opioids for detox, but they wouldn't actually start you on maintenance. So I left that rehab feeling good, and I came up here again, and it's hard to say now whether or not that was a mistake. But anyway, I also 2 years into this maybe 8 or 9 year repetitive hell, I went out to Hawaii to stay with my godfather and my aunt on Maui, and they sort of like helped nurse me back to health and productivity. And I came back to my hometown in upstate New York. After that, I applied to medical school, got into a couple programs, ended up doing a year at a state medical school in New Jersey. So that was, felt like my life was getting back on track. And I tried hard in the beginning to try to make sure that I was really gonna like just exit the whole addiction fiasco. I had a friend from treatment who is a vascular surgeon now who followed that path out of addiction, and I was trying to do the same thing, but it still had its claws in me so much. So my whole first year in med school, I was doing well academically, but I was also from time to time like going to urgent cares to get opioid and benzo scripts. When I get those benzo scripts, I would just like go on a binge for a couple of days, neglect all my responsibilities, and then wake up and just, you get that panic, got to bring everything back together, figure out what you messed up. And by the end of the year, everything, again, academically and socially was in order, but I was just like so exhausted from that. And it was so obvious that this was not going to pan out. Like there was just a matter of time before things imploded further. That, I had an overdose at one point in that first year where I was actually hospitalized at the teaching hospital for my school, which is like the worst thing you can happen to you as a medical student. Didn't even really bother me at the time. But anyway, I'd had some close calls with like, wow, if it weren't for HIPAA, I would probably be kicked out of school right now. But yeah, so by the end of that year, just really burnt out and really just, all I was so demoralized from trying to stay clean and not being able to, that I just want to be able to use in peace. There was something about me at that point, like I just accepted the extinction vortex. I was like, I'm going to go down the drain, but at least I will save myself the hell of trying to have to present like this functional version of myself to society every day, because the stress of doing that on top of maintaining this incredibly demanding drug addiction is something that no one who has ever who hasn't experienced it can probably appreciate. It is unbelievably wearying, and the cognitive dissonance is harmful in and of itself, even if you're carrying out the sort of like performative aspect of that whole charade. Okay, so stuck in that whole pattern through my late 20s, I think till I was 27 or 28, made it past the forever 27 age, and I think things started to get better in the second half of my 20s. I didn't realize it at the time because it was a frog boiling slowly in the water kind of phenomenon, but the real strong ups and downs of my addiction, and the attitude of like, I'm going to be dead tomorrow, nothing practical matters, started to leave me. The same time fentanyl was entering the US opioid supply. So I lost like 8 to 10 friends, like real friends, people I had lived daily life with, gone to meetings with, people who I was really close to, like unprecedentedly close to. I had lost in the space of maybe 3 to 4 years after fentanyl came into the US dope supply. So I still had the mentality that I probably wasn't going to live past 30, but I had learned to sort of smooth out some of the ups and downs. I had learned that, like, I cannot take benzos at all. I become a feral monster when I do that. And I had learned, like, okay, if I relapse on dope, I can kind of like engineer it so, like, I can use for a few days to a couple of weeks, and then I can use Suboxone to taper myself off of opioids. So I can sort of like maximize the relapse while minimizing the consequences to my life. So toward the end of my 20s, I started working for a criminal justice reform nonprofit in my hometown. Liked the job, but I was still like, I had more than my toes in the drug waters at the time in my hometown. And I think eventually it would have become a problem if I hadn't left after like just over a year. So one of my best friends from undergrad, who was like a sister to me, she dated my older brother for a while after she knew me for a few years. So she almost became literally a sister to me. Had gotten a graduate degree in education, and she had moved to mainland China, and she had lived there and taught there for several years at that point. And she was living in a city called Shenzhen, which is right next to Hong Kong. And we call it the Silicon Valley of China because of the preponderance of tech and finance companies. It is kind of California-like in weather. It is unbelievable how much money and success there is in the city that is like as big as New York plus LA combined. That in the 1970s was literally just a fishing port, like a rural fishing port on the coast of southern China. So it's an incredible city. She told me that I would love it. She told me that the students were awesome. I had always thought I'd probably end up teaching in a medical school. So like I had, TA experiences in undergrad. I had considered teaching high school science, but again, I had always pictured myself contributing to like the problem solving side of science in some way, although I knew I wouldn't be a good fit for bench research. So I thought like clinical research would be a good fit for me. But anyway, I'm getting off track. So I took Andy up on her offer. She was like an amazing friend. I had no extra money at the time. So she flew me to China, sent me up in an apartment with her twin sister, Sophie. And first year and a half in China was up there with my first year of college in terms of one of those times in my life that has been just so happy and so productive that it's sort of like it makes all the other hell worthwhile. So I get there and I'm in withdrawal from opioids and benzos, but I'm so everything is so new, and there are so many demands from me work wise. I'm working like 6 days a week. I'm teaching sometimes 10 or 12 hours a day, and I don't have time to be sick. And when I do have a little bit of free time, like I want to go out and explore it. It's like take advantage of this entirely new setting. Like in a lot of ways, especially because I was making more money through the private sector education stuff in China than I ever thought I would make outside of medicine. Like I finally had the opportunity to enjoy a big city in the way that I had not been able to enjoy New York City in my early 20s. So, anyway, that first year and a half, I became a partner in this educational consulting group that basically helps Chinese students who want to study in the US learn how to apply, pick programs, sort of like strategize about how they're going to present themselves, do interview prep, all that kind of stuff. So became a partner in that group. I taught in small group in the standard classroom setting. I was teaching bio and chem, so it was stuff that I love to talk about, and it's very practical and applied. So my students were like literally some of the best students in China, and to this day, they are students who, like any teacher out there who is listening to this, they're the kind of students like you close your eyes and you hope that you will have a classroom full of students like this, like just so enthused and respectful and personable, like interesting in their own right, even at that age. So awesome time. I also, like 6 or 8 months in, I meet my fiance, Jay. So he is an accountant. He is working for at the time for a biotech company that is in the high tech park area of Shenzhen, where I'm also working. So fell in love with Shenzhen and that whole greater Hong Kong area, like Andy knew that I would. Meet my fiance. I'm doing really well work wise. And that first year and a half of exploring China and then coming back home with Jay, having Jay meet my family and, see the US for the first time, all of that stuff is just so close to what I would have hoped for my life, that like for the first time I'm like maybe believing that things are going to get better for me and then I'm going to have something like a normal rest of my life. Okay, so narrator chimes in. He did not have a normal rest of his life, but by the way, when I was recording this video for the first time, I was talking about the addictive predisposition on one side of my family. And I was saying every male member of that side of my family. And I didn't even realize till I was watching those few minutes that I had recorded afterward how stupid that sounded, but specifically how gay stupid that sounded. And I just remind myself of if you guys ever watched Arrested Development, of Tobias Funke, who is married to this like bombshell hot blonde character, but the joke in the whole first season of Arrested Development is that he's gay and everyone else knows it, but he doesn't realize it. So he says that he's a psychiatrist, but he says he's like the world's first analyst combined with therapist, so he calls it an analrapist. So think about how you spell that and you'll get the joke. But anyway, I find myself pulling like Tobias Funke's and I don't realize it till I look back at the videos that I was trying to record. So hopefully I'm doing better with that this time around. But now that I've gotten myself completely off tangent with the Arrested Development narrator style override, long story short, through talking to other expats, came to realize that, yeah, recreational drugs are almost totally not present in China, or at least very, very niche. And addiction in general is very minimal there compared to what we're used to in the West in general and in the US specifically. However, there are hospitals and international clinics where you can get opioids and benzos. They exist, and Chinese doctors know that foreigners are likely to be looking for them and have kind of a laissez-faire attitude about kind of the opposite of when in Rome. They're like, we're treating a foreigner. Foreigners do these harder drugs, so even though we never give them to a Chinese person, we'll give them to a foreigner if they come looking for it. So took me a while to be able to get the good stuff prescription wise, but I'm not going to talk too much about exactly how I ended up doing it. But long story short, I ended up through a pharmacist having access to the original formulation 40 milligram Oxycontin pills. So when I say original formulation, part of the Purdue scandal was that the original formulation of the OCs that we all got into opioids using. So these pills were so common. I say this on my blog that at high school house parties and even during school, I remember seeing gold and turquoise smudges on people's shirts from them wiping the extended release coating off of these pills to snort them, to grind them up and snort them, or just take them orally and have them hit quicker. This extended release coating, it didn't work even if you took it orally the way you were supposed to. It essentially just dissolved as soon as it hit anything that was water based. So even the acid in your stomach. So by the time these pills hit you, it was a full 40 milligram dose of oxycodone. And for those of you who aren't sort of like knowledgeable about opioids, that is every bit as strong and euphoric a high as heroin. It is essentially just heroin at that point. It's Coke and Pepsi. So anyway, that formulation had played a huge role in generating the opioid epidemic in the U.S. So by they I mean the federal government, specifically the FDA, required Purdue to stop selling that formulation. They required them to reformulate with a wax-based matrix that actually was very hard to abuse. It actually did what it was supposed to. And so in the US, those pills had become like almost like, quaaludes or something like that, like a holy grail that defined a time period that are no longer available. So I get to China, I get prescribed 40 milligram oxycontin for the first time, take it home, and what do I see? Instead of the reformulated OP stamp on the pill, I see OC. So these evil bastards are still selling the original highly addictive formulation in China because the Chinese government doesn't know what happened here, apparently, or at least doesn't care. So maybe just because the use of those strong meds is essentially like you have to be dying to get them in China anyway. So I get those original formulation OCs, and impossible to get a needle in China, so I'm just snorting them. And for the first time, I can really afford my habit. For $100 a day, which I can make in an hour of tutoring or 90 minutes of tutoring, I can get 800 milligrams of OC40 pills. So I use and use and use, and I kind of plateau at 600 milligrams a day, which is like an elephantine dose of oxycodone. But I'm also using benzos, which I can get from time to time. And on top of that, there's an OTC formulation of phenobarbital that I was also adding along with alcohol to kind of break through my opioid tolerance. So I was in China for maybe 4 years before the pandemic, and for those third and fourth years, the addictive thing is becoming more and more pronounced. But again, for the first time, I'm like a functional addict because I can afford it. So I'm still working hard. I'm not really getting any major life problems, although it created stress with my partner. It did to a certain extent because those international clinics know who they're dealing with, and they're sort of in gray area to prescribe this much of those type of meds. They're charging you like up the wazoo for it. So there were times when I would leave the international clinic with a bill for like 15 or 16,000 RMB, which is like a couple grand US dollars. So that was something that I would do like once a week, maybe. So it adds up. But yeah, so the pandemic is when things really just, the center cannot hold and things fall apart. So first of all, my source of OxyContin is no longer able to ship it everywhere in China overnight, so it becomes an issue of supply and acting erratic when I can't get the medicine. Secondly, it becomes almost impossible to stay in China as a foreigner. The testing requirements and all of the paperwork surrounding your travel within the country, and if you want to go home, it became so expensive and so difficult. I had to stay separately from Jay in a hotel because as a foreigner, you're even if you've been in China the whole time of the pandemic, you're scrutinized more than a Chinese person, and there are areas of the city that are now forbidden to go in. There's an app we all have to have that shows our most recent testing results and where we've traveled within the country. So it gets really intense. I hang on by my fingernails because I know that if I go home, it's really likely that I'll get trapped there. But eventually it's too much. And I tell Jay that I have to go back home for now, which he totally understands. So go back home. I am in full cold turkey opioid and benzo withdrawal. It is at that point maybe the sickest I've ever been. I go 3 days puking maybe 3 times an hour. On the third day, I have to get something down food wise. So I just have a little bit of soup, probably from the salt absorbing in my system and then the water following. My neck starts swelling up so much that like my breathing is stertorous. Like it's just a really high keening noise I never heard before. My dad sees that and calls the ambulance because like I thought I was maybe in that moment dying. So that's one of my worst fears, by the way, is dying in drug withdrawal. So kind of tells you, gives me gives you a sense of my priorities and who you're dealing with, right? But so I'm in that state, and I'm just like, I need anything to get out of that. I had money, but I wasn't able to, I didn't have any of my old numbers or anything. And so I had a family member who goes to the methadone clinic in Syracuse. And for the first time, I was like, I'm going to do that. Forget Suboxone, because I knew my habit was so high that Suboxone would have made me incredibly sick. So I'm like, I'm going to start on methadone. And things had changed during the years I was out of the US. The opioid epidemic had gotten a lot of recognition. Xylazine, trank, which I write about a lot on my blog, had started to creep into the drug supply. So there is a lot of pressure to get people off of street opioids. And because of that, I was able to get in the methadone clinic. Whereas in my 20s, it would have been a 9-month waiting list to get into this methadone clinic. When I come back in my early 30s, it is a 3-day wait. It's literally going in on Friday. I start at, mind you, a very low dose that leaves me still in severe withdrawal, but I start the Monday following. So progress has been made. If you want to be on opioid maintenance in the US, real progress has been made about the availability of that, at least in states that haven't restricted it overly much. So started on methadone, and after a few months, I have my falling out of love with maintenance phase. I never really stabilized on methadone, unlike buprenorphine, which is a partial agonist. So write about this on the blog too, and again, I'll drop the link below. But the partial agonist, you hit the ceiling, and then if you take more, there's no additional opioid effect. So with Suboxone, it was my experience, you kind of do just stabilize on it, and it fades into the back of your mind. With methadone, a full agonist, the more you take, the more opioid stimulation there is, all the way up till you die. So like, because of that, you're getting these ups and downs, and I burn it off very quickly. So I'm getting bigger ups and downs than you're supposed to have, and feels a lot like active addiction to methadone. So after a few months, I try getting off of it, taper down to 70 milligrams a day, and I relapse on fentanyl, have a catastrophic overdose, and I'm in the cardiovascular ICU for like over a week. It was at least a week that I was in the hospital, just nothing to do for the first few days, just staring at the wall. And that was actually a big part of the origin story for my blog, which I, of course, have linked below, the Concrete Confessional blog. I had written in bits and pieces about my addictive experience. I had actually in my early 20s written an entire 100,000 word autobiographical novel about my addiction. And I had wanted to publish some of this stuff, if for no other reason than to sort of like document the war on drugs from the front lines in the opioid epidemic that had taken so many of my friends, from the perspective of someone who had lived through it. Like, to this day, I haven't seen any addiction memoir that shines the light on this whole societal phenomenon for the lost generation of millennials, and the way that I wish someone would shine a light on it. So anyway, I got this panic. I'm laying in the hospital, and I get this panic about like not having all these stories that I haven't shared, and realizing like, yeah, I have these things I've written, but like traditional publishing is going to take so long. Depending on how things go PR wise, I might only get a few hundred or a couple thousand readers anyway. And it's like, I feel this burden of like having all this stuff I want to say and never having just unloaded it. So for the first time, I'm like, I'm just going to go public. I'm going to attach my face to it, and I'm going to write about this regardless of the consequences. So get out of the hospital. I go way up on my methadone dose. So I finally stabilize at a dose near 200 milligrams a day, which is a whopping dose of opioid. They won't allow me to take gabapentin or a small dose of benzo that is easy to sort of not abuse, like clonazepam. And because of that, I'm kind of using the methadone for everything. I'm using it for anxiety relief. I'm using it for sleep. And I have to go up way higher on my dose than I would have otherwise because of that. So I end up on like 200 milligrams a day of methadone and blogging for a year. And that takes us to several months ago, when I decide I need to get off of methadone. So I've kind of already foreshadowed the reasons for that. It's that dimmer switch thing, in addition to being chained to the clinic and not being able to return to China, or, not being able to travel without obtaining prior permission, not being able to take other medications that might help me for things like insomnia and anxiety. In addition to all of that, it's just like my creativity is gone. I'm content to sit around all day, not because I'm sedated. I'm not one of those people who's like falling asleep on methadone. It's just because I have that artificial contentment. You know, when Marx said religion is the opiate of the masses, you know, no shade on religion, but there's a reason why he chose opiates compared to any other drug. They really specifically just induce this kind of like, it's like a spiritual torpor. It's like you're content just to lay around and not really do much of anything other than the bare minimum to maintain your laying around. So I know that I have to get off of methadone, and a few months ago I started trying. About like 40 from 50 milligrams into that whole process, I relapsed, and for a few weeks I started using fent, and in that it's contaminated with xylazine around here now, so almost certainly trank as well. And pull myself out of it. I realize I get an opportunity so that this coming fall I can return to China. I can also go to visit my partner, Jay, who's working in the greater London area in the UK at the moment. So like I can get out of here and return to a much better life, but I have to get off of methadone first. So I buckled down like maybe 3.5 months ago. I stopped screwing up, and I just tell myself it is going to get worse before it gets better, but like you are going to go through this now without relapsing. And so far it's been going pretty well. So when you go to my clinic and you tell them I want to get off of this stuff, they tell you there's no infrastructure in place for that. The data shows that, you know, 80 something percent of people who try to get off of methadone are back on IV drugs within a year. So they do not recommend that you do that, although there are problems with the very small studies that they're getting those numbers from, which I'll talk about in a later video. But anyway, they tell you we don't have any sort of infrastructure in place. We don't prescribe meds for the withdrawal symptoms that you have. You know, if you're going to do it, they recommend like this glacially slow pace, like literally like 2 to 5 milligrams a month. So it takes people like 5 years to taper off. Like I'm in my mid 30s. I don't have 5 years to do this stuff. I'm trying to get back to China ideally. So, you know, I'm doing it at 10 milligrams a week, which, as I think I mentioned earlier in the video, that's faster than like a very hardcore gel would have done it during the glory years of the opioid epidemic, when there was like absolutely no sympathy for heroin addicts. And in fact, a lot of COs kind of like enjoyed torturing addicts. So I'm torturing myself right now, basically. And as I said, it's going to get worse in some ways before it gets better, but I'm on track to be off of it completely in 2.5 to 3 months from now if I keep going at this pace, with some allowance at the end for, you know, 5 milligrams a week in the last month of things, so that I'm not just totally devastated when I'm finally taking none every day. So this video has gone over the 45-minute to 1 hour benchmark that I was hoping for. You made it this far. Thank you so much for listening. Like, genuinely, it's wild to me that anyone would choose to listen to me for this long. So my typical videos are going to be probably half this in length, but there's a lot to get through in this initial video. And yeah, I guess the final thing I would want to say is that if anyone is out there struggling with addiction, or has a family member who's struggling with addiction right now, it is the most isolating, demoralizing thing that I can imagine. Again, I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy. And one of my favorite things about my blog is I have like the contact page at concreteconfessionalblog.com. And every single week I have 2 or 3 people get in touch who are like in extremis, either in withdrawal or they have a loved one who is totally going through addictive hell. And I always respond within 12 to 24 hours. And I am like genuinely always here to talk. So if you are in that situation, you feel like I have no one I can talk to about this, you now have someone you can talk to for real. So with that, I think I will leave this off. I care about all you guys, and I hope everyone is doing okay.